My name is Naomi Calloway. I am 45 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I walked into the 40th anniversary gala for Renfield Industries on the arm of a man my entire family had spent a decade telling me I would never be good enough to stand next to. Not romantically, professionally. Which, in my family, has always amounted to the same accusation. The room was gold and glass, 500 people deep, string quartet in the corner playing something that sounded like money. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne balanced like they'd been trained on a tightrope. A projection screen at the far end of the ballroom cycled through 40 years of company history, black and white photographs of a single delivery truck dissolving slowly into a fleet that now spanned 4 continents. I stood near the entrance for a moment before walking in, the way I always do before an important meeting, running through the facts one last time, the way other people might check their reflection. My father was already there, tie straight, drink in hand, laughing at something his regional director had said. He saw me first. Then he saw who was beside me. I watched the laugh die on his face in real time, the way a signal dies when you walk out of range. He set his drink down on a passing tray without looking at it. He said, "Naomi, what is he doing with you? Not hello, not you look well. What is he doing with you?" As if my presence next to his boss required an explanation, as if I were the anomaly and not the woman he'd spent 45 years training everyone in this family to underestimate. I didn't answer him right away. I want you to sit with that question for a second, the way I had to sit with it in that ballroom, because the answer to it was going to end my father's career, unwind 11 months of fraud, and finally, close a file I'd been keeping since the summer I turned 34. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Welcome back to Calm Karma Stories, where ordinary people face impossible family moments and walk out the other side with their dignity intact. If you've ever been the competent one, the reliable one, the one everyone calls when something's broken and nobody calls when something's worth celebrating, this story is for you. Drop a comment and let me know if you've ever had a family motto used against you like a verdict. And please subscribe. It helps more than you'd think. Let me back up. Because none of what happened in that ballroom makes sense unless you understand what happened over the 11 years before it. I'm a forensic auditor. Specifically, I run engagements for a risk and compliance firm that gets called in when a company's internal numbers stop agreeing with its external story. Banks hire us before acquisitions. Boards hire us after they start losing sleep. I've spent 2 decades learning how to read a general ledger the way other people read a face, for the tell, the hesitation, the place where the story doesn't quite match the timeline. I made partner track senior reviewer at 38, the youngest in my firm's history at the time, on the strength of a single engagement where I found $9 million in improperly capitalized expenses that 3 other reviewers before me had missed entirely. I order the same thing every morning at the same diner 2 blocks from my office before every job that matters. An Americano, no room, extra shot. Not because I need the caffeine, because it's a ritual, and rituals are how I tell myself the day is under control before the day has had a chance to prove otherwise. And before I sign anything, a report, a filing, a document with my name on it. I tap my pen twice against the desk. My assistant used to tease me about it. I told her it was superstition. It isn't. It's a pause. A last chance to ask myself if I actually believe what I'm about to put my name to. I was 34 the first time my mother said the sentence that would follow me for the next 11 years. We were at my cousin Ivy's wedding, and I was standing near the gift table, and my mother introduced me to a woman from her book club as my daughter, the accountant, still figuring things out. Then, quieter, meant only for the woman, but pitched exactly loud enough for me to hear, she said, "A woman without a ring is a woman without a home." That was the first time. The second time was at Thanksgiving, 2 years later, when my younger sister Callie announced she was pregnant with her second child, and my mother lifted her wine glass and said it again, this time aimed at the whole table, dressed up as a toast. To women who understand that a home isn't built out of spreadsheets, a woman without a ring is a woman without a home. Everyone laughed. I smiled, because that's what you do. And I ate my dinner, and I drove myself home that night to an apartment I owned outright, mortgage paid off in full 4 years earlier, which is more than I can say for anyone else at that table. The third time was the year my father got promoted to Regional Vice President of Finance at Renfield Industries, and at his celebration dinner, when someone asked if I had anyone special in my life, My mother answered for me before I could open my mouth. She's 42 and still married to her job. A woman without a ring is a woman without a home. My father laughed the loudest. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for what comes later. I was never angry about being unmarried. I liked my life. I built it on purpose, plank by plank, and it held weight. What I was angry about, quietly, patiently, the way I'm angry about everything, which is to say I filed it rather than raged about it, was that my family had decided my worth was a math problem with only one variable, and the variable wasn't income or stability or the fact that I was the one who wired money to my parents twice in the last decade when their own finances went sideways. The variable was a ring, and I didn't have one. So in their accounting, I was worth nothing. There was a fourth time the sentence got said, and I only mention it because it's the one that finally taught me to stop expecting the room to correct itself. It was at my own birthday dinner, my 44th, at a restaurant I'd chosen and paid for, and my mother raised a glass to Callie's oldest daughter instead, congratulating her on getting engaged at 23, and said, looking somewhere just past my shoulder so she wouldn't have to say it directly to my face, "See, this one already understands what matters. A woman without a ring is a woman without a home." Nobody at that table, my table, on my birthday, thought to redirect the toast. I sat there with a slice of cake I'd ordered myself, and I understood, finally, that the sentence wasn't really about marriage at all. It was a tool. A way to make sure I never took up more space in that family's story than the role they'd assigned me. Useful, dependable, and permanently unfinished. I was the fixer. Every family has one. When my mother's roof needed replacing, and my parents were 3 months behind on the mortgage, I paid the roofer directly and told my mother it was a discount through my company, because I knew if I told her the truth, she'd spend the money on something else and let the roof leak into the guest room for another winter. When Callie's husband lost his job for 4 months, I covered their health insurance premium without either of them asking, routing it through an automatic payment so nobody had to have the conversation. When my father needed a cosigner for a car loan 2 years ago, I signed. I always signed. I was reliable in the specific way that people stop noticing reliability once they've come to expect it as weather. There was a particular week, 5 years ago, that I still think of as the clearest version of my role in that family. My mother needed a procedure that wasn't fully covered by her insurance. My father was between bonus cycles and short on cash, and Callie was 7 months pregnant and understandably not in a position to help. I flew home on a Thursday, sat in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours, paid the outstanding balance before I left on Sunday, and was back at my desk Monday morning as if none of it had happened. Nobody at that Thanksgiving, 4 weeks later, mentioned it. My mother did mention, twice, how lovely it was that Callie's husband had learned to carve a turkey. I remember driving home that night, thinking that I had apparently become the kind of family member whose contributions were expected rather than acknowledged. The way you don't thank a furnace for keeping the house warm in January. You just assume it will keep working, right up until the day it doesn't. And I was the erased one. At every holiday photo, I was asked to take the picture instead of being in it. At every toast, I was the audience, never the subject, unless the subject was my failure to secure a husband. My accomplishments, the promotion, the corner office, the year I led the audit that recovered $11 million in misallocated funds for a client and got written up in an industry journal, were met with polite nods and a fast pivot back to Callie's kids, or Callie's house, or Callie's marriage, which had become, in my family's internal ledger, the only asset class that counted. There was a wedding, my cousin Preston's older sister, actually 3 years before any of this started, where the seating chart placed me at a table with my parents' neighbors instead of the family table, because, as my mother explained it afterward, "We didn't want you sitting alone without a +1. It looked better this way." I didn't argue. I sat with the neighbors, made pleasant conversation about their sprinkler system, and watched my family laugh together across the room at a table I'd been quietly priced out of by a rule nobody had ever bothered to apply to any of my married relatives, several of whom had brought dates they'd been seeing for exactly 6 weeks. Here's the part that's hard to admit. For years, I let it happen, because the alternative, standing up at a table and demanding to be seen, felt beneath the version of myself I was trying to be. Composed. Above it. I told myself that not needing their approval was its own kind of victory, which was true. But it also meant I never noticed how much room my silence gave them to keep building on a foundation of me. That foundation had a name: my grandmother's cabin. My grandmother, Eleanor Voss Calloway, my father's mother, had a lake house on 11 acres upstate that she'd owned outright since 1974. When she passed away 9 years ago, she left the cabin in a family trust with 3 named beneficiaries: my father, my Aunt Ruth, and me, equal thirds. Not because she loved me more than my siblings. I don't have any other siblings besides Callie, who wasn't named because my grandmother, in her words, already gave Callie the china. I was named because I was the one who drove up there every summer to help her fix the dock, replace the water heater, deal with the county on the septic permit. My grandmother used to say I was the only one who showed up for the boring parts, and the boring parts are where a house actually lives. The cabin was appraised, the year she died, at just under $2.1 million. Lake frontage in that county had exploded in value. None of us needed the money. But my father, as it turned out, needed the money very badly, and I didn't find that out until 11 months ago. Let me back up again, because you need the company piece to understand what my father actually did. My father had worked at Renfield Industries for 19 years, most of them in the regional finance office, the last 4 as regional vice president. Renfield Industries is a logistics and freight conglomerate founded and still majority owned by a man named Marcus Renfield, who built it from a single trucking route in the 70s into a company that now moves freight across 4 continents. Marcus Renfield is, by any conventional measure, a billionaire. He's also, by the account of everyone who's worked closely with him, allergic to being lied to, and specifically, obsessively serious about the integrity of his company's books, because he'd watched 2 competitors collapse in the 90s over exactly that kind of rot. He has a reputation, inside the industry, for reading audit reports personally, cover to cover, rather than delegating that task to a subordinate the way most executives at his level would. I did not know until 11 months ago that my father's regional office was under quiet internal review for a pattern of reimbursement irregularities. And I certainly did not know that my firm would be the one hired to run that review. Here's the part my father did not know. 3 years before any of this, completely independent of my family, my firm had done a smaller compliance engagement for one of Renfield Industries' subsidiary logistics hubs. I wasn't the lead on that one. A colleague was, but my name was on the client roster, quietly, as a senior reviewer. Marcus Renfield remembered my name from that report. He remembered it because I'd flagged something in that engagement that saved the subsidiary $400,000 in penalties, and because, in his words, when we finally met in person, you were the only auditor on that file who didn't try to make the bad news sound smaller than it was. So when a pattern of irregularities surfaced in his father's regional office 11 months ago, inflated vendor invoices, reimbursements routed to an LLC that didn't seem to do any actual work, a notary stamp that showed up on far too many internal documents for one small county office, Marcus Renfield called my firm. He asked, specifically, for the reviewer who didn't make bad news sound smaller than it was. He did not know that reviewer's father was the man under investigation. I found that out on a Tuesday morning, reading the engagement brief, seeing my father's name. Walter Calloway, Regional VP of Finance, listed as the executive whose division was under scope. I sat with my Americano, no room, extra shot, going cold in front of me, for 11 minutes before I called my managing partner. I told him everything. That the subject of the review was my father. That I believed I could remain objective, because objectivity was, professionally, the only thing I actually trusted about myself. That I wanted to stay on the engagement, not despite the conflict, but because I understood the specific texture of my father's signature, his habits, his blind spots, better than any auditor who'd never met him. My partner didn't say yes immediately. He said he'd need to disclose the relationship to the client. He said the decision would be Marcus Renfield's, not mine. 2 days later, I got a call. Marcus Renfield, personally, not through an assistant. He asked me one question. Do you think you can find the truth even if it costs your father his job? I tapped my pen twice against my desk before I answered. I already know the truth costs him something, I said. The only question is whether I'm the one who finds it or whether it finds him some other way, later, worse. He said that was the right answer. He kept me on the engagement. He also said something else that stayed with me longer than I expected it to. He said, I've had a lot of people in my life tell me what I wanted to hear because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. I don't have a lot of patience left for that, at my age. I'd rather have the truth from someone who isn't afraid of me than comfort from someone who is. I didn't say much in response. I just told him I'd have my findings to him within the timeline we'd agreed on, and I meant it. Now let's go back to the cabin, because this is where the two threads, my family and my job, braid together in a way that even I didn't see coming until the evidence made it impossible not to. 8 months into the engagement, on a Sunday call, I almost didn't answer. My father told me he wanted to simplify the cabin trust. His words. He said the property taxes were becoming a burden to manage across 3 beneficiaries, that Aunt Ruth wanted out entirely, that the cleanest solution was for the 2 of them to buy out my third at fair market value, and that his lawyer had already drawn up the paperwork. He said it the way he says everything that requires my compliance. Warmly. Reasonably. Like the decision had already been made, and my role was simply to sign where indicated. I asked to see the paperwork before I signed anything. He said his lawyer would send it. He said, and I remember this specific phrase because it echoed something else I'd hear again soon. "It's just a formality, Naomi. Nobody's trying to take anything from you. I want you to remember that phrase. Just a formality. Hold on to it." 3 weeks after that call, in my professional capacity, not my personal one, I was reviewing a batch of internal documents pulled from my father's regional office as part of discovery for the fraud engagement. Notarized reimbursement forms, vendor contracts, and filed in a folder that had nothing to do with Renfield Industries at all, because someone in that office had apparently used the company scanner and company file server for personal business, a quitclaim deed, for the cabin, dated 2 months earlier, bearing my signature, a signature I had never made. I want to describe the moment I saw it, because I think it's the moment this whole story actually starts, even though everything before it was the kindling. I did not gasp. I did not call anyone immediately. I sat very still at my desk, the way I sit still when a client's numbers stop telling the truth, and I opened a blank evidence log, the same kind I open on every engagement, and I typed a header. Item 1. Item 1, quitclaim deed, cabin property, dated 11 weeks prior, purporting to convey Naomi Calloway's 1/3 interest to Walter Calloway and Ruth Calloway Hesse. Signature does not match any known exemplar. Filed via scanned upload, timestamp consistent with Renfield Industries' regional office network, outside of business hours. I sat with that for a long time. Then I kept working, because the evidence log doesn't fill itself, and because I had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you can do with a discovery like that is react before you understand its full shape. Over the following 6 weeks, item 1 became item 11. I should explain what those 6 weeks actually looked like, because forensic work is not a montage. It's long stretches of nothing, spreadsheets that resolve into more spreadsheets, followed by short bursts where a single date lines up with another date, and the whole shape of a lie becomes visible at once. I worked those weeks the way I work every engagement. Mornings with my Americano, no room, extra shot, evenings cross-referencing bank records against a timeline taped, in my mind, if not literally on a wall, to the 11 years of family dinners where I'd been told what I was worth. Item 2. A notary stamp. The same notary stamp. Appearing on the fraudulent deed and on 4 separate reimbursement forms already flagged in the Renfield engagement, all from a notary public, whose commission, according to the county's public registry, had actually expired 14 months earlier. Someone was using a dead stamp. Item 3. Bank records showing an LLC called Ridgemont Property Solutions, registered 4 months before the deed, with my father listed as the sole organizing member, receiving 3 reimbursement payments from Renfield Industries, totaling $86,400 for consulting services that no one in the regional office could describe when asked. Item 4. A wire transfer, 2 weeks after the deed was filed, from an account linked to Ridgemont Property Solutions to my father's personal checking account for $340,000, consistent with a rushed, under-market private sale of the cabin's 1/3 share to a buyer who, item 5, turned out to be a shell entity controlled by my Aunt Ruth's son, my cousin Preston, who had no genuine interest in lake property, and every interest in flipping it within the year. Item 6. Text messages, obtained lawfully as part of the Renfield discovery process because they'd been sent from a company-issued phone between my father and Preston, discussing getting Naomi's piece sorted before she notices, and a reply from Preston that read, and I am going to say this exactly because it matters, she'll never check. She trusts family too much. Item 7, which I almost missed because it wasn't financial at all. A calendar entry synced automatically from my father's company phone to a shared family calendar he'd forgotten. I still had access to from years earlier when I used to help coordinate my parents' medical appointments. The entry, dated the week before the forged deed was filed, was titled simply "In Cabin, Handle Before Q Close." Not a threat. Not even, in his mind, probably a crime. Just a line item on a to-do list, the same way I imagine he'd write "renew car registration." I was a task. A formality to be handled before a quarterly close, filed somewhere between an oil change and an expense report. I read that calendar entry at 11:40 at night, alone in my apartment. The mortgage I'd paid off myself, sitting quiet around me. And for the first time in this entire process, I let myself feel something before I filed it. Not rage. Something colder and more useful. Certainty. Item 8 through 12. I'll spare you the granular detail. Additional falsified reimbursement records, a second forged notarization on an unrelated vendor contract, evidence that the same scanning pattern used to fabricate my signature had been used to fabricate a signature on a company expense report 6 months earlier, and financial modeling showing that my father's regional office had a shortfall of just over $410,000 that had been quietly patched, piece by piece, using a combination of the Ridgemont LLC reimbursements and the proceeds from selling my cabin share out from under me. My father wasn't trying to simplify a trust. My father was drowning in a hole he'd dug at work, and he'd used my grandmother's cabin and my signature as one of the shovels he used to climb halfway out. Here's what my father did not know. Sitting in his office at Renfield Industries, believing the deed was filed and the money was moved and the problem was quietly behind him. He did not know that the forensic reviewer assigned to the exact irregularities that had forced his hand. The reviewer whose report would determine whether he kept his job, whether he faced civil recovery, whether Marcus Renfield referred the matter to the district attorney's office for prosecution, was his own daughter. The one he'd been telling, for 11 years, that she was worth less than a ring. Stay with me, because what happens next is the part I still think about. If you've made it this far, please subscribe, because the next 15 minutes are the reason I'm telling this story at all. 6 days before the anniversary gala, my father called me. He was warm again, the way he gets when he wants something. He said the family was hosting a small gathering before the big Renfield event. A dinner at my parents' house, just family, to celebrate his upcoming promotion to senior vice president. A promotion that, unbeknownst to him, existed only because the board hadn't yet seen my final report. He said it would mean a lot if I came. He said, and again, that specific phrase, "There's also a small formality with the cabin paperwork we should wrap up while everyone's together." Nothing dramatic, just needs your signature on file to close it out clean. I understood, in that moment, precisely what was happening. The recorder's office in the county where the cabin sits had flagged the original deed for review. I'd learned this independently through the fraud audit's parallel civil recovery track, because forged instruments filed with a lapsed notary commission trigger an automatic compliance hold once the county's system cross-references active commissions. The deed was sitting in limbo. It hadn't fully cleared. My father needed a clean signature, a real one, obtained under pressure at a family dinner before the county's 5-day compliance window expired and the whole transaction got kicked back for fraud review. 5 days. That was his ticking clock, and he had no idea I already had my own clock running underneath his. I went to the dinner. I sat at that table and watched my mother serve pot roast and repeat, for the 5th time in 11 years, in a slightly different arrangement of words but the same architecture, that a woman who reached 45 without a ring on her hand had built herself a very impressive, very empty house. Callie laughed, a little more quietly than usual, I noticed, though I didn't understand why until her text arrived weeks later. My father smiled at his plate. I ate my pot roast, and I thought about the 12 items in a file on my laptop, sitting 11 miles away in my apartment, and I said nothing, because saying something before the timing was right would have cost me the one advantage I actually had. Near the end of the meal, my father slid a folder across the table toward me, casual, practiced, and said the words I'd been waiting 11 days to hear out loud instead of read on a subpoenaed document. "It's just a formality, Naomi. Sign here, and we can all move forward." I looked at the folder. It was thin, Cream-colored, the kind of folder you buy in a 3-pack from an office supply store, entirely unremarkable, which is exactly the kind of folder you'd choose if you wanted a $2.1 million property transfer to look like nothing at all. I looked at my father. I tapped my pen twice against the table, out of habit, and I did not open it. I said, "I'll need my own attorney to review anything with my name on it before I sign. That's not personal. That's how I do business." My mother said I was being difficult, that this was exactly the kind of thing she meant when she said I treated my own family like a client instead of family. My father said there wasn't time to be difficult, that the paperwork needed to close by the end of the week. I asked him why the timing mattered so specifically. He said it was just administrative. I asked him, gently, the way I ask a client's CFO, a question I already know the answer to, whether the paperwork had anything to do with a company called Ridgemont Property Solutions. The room went quiet in a way I want you to really picture. Not dramatic, just still. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My mother looked between us, confused, because she didn't know yet what that name meant. Callie looked at her phone, and I noticed, only in hindsight, that her thumb had stopped moving across the screen. My father set his fork down and said, carefully, in a voice that had lost the warmth it started the dinner with, "Where did you hear that name?" I said, "I'll see you at the gala on Saturday, Dad." And I left the folder on the table, unsigned, and I drove home. That was Tuesday. The gala was Saturday. 4 days. I spent those 4 days finishing my report, and I also spent them doing something I hadn't done in 11 years, which was sitting with the full weight of what my family had actually cost me, instead of filing the feeling away the way I filed everything else. I sat in my apartment on Wednesday night with the 12 items spread across my desk, and I let myself think, just once, about how different those 11 years might have looked if even one person at one of those dinners had said, "That's enough," instead of laughing along. Nobody had. Not my mother, not my father, not Callie, not Aunt Ruth. I was the only one in that family who had ever, at any point, drawn a line and defended it, and I was about to do it again, this time with documents instead of silence. I want to tell you what a forensic report actually looks like when it's done right, because it isn't a scene from a courtroom drama. It's 41 pages, single-spaced, with exhibits attached as appendices, written in the driest prose you've ever encountered, because drama is the enemy of credibility in my line of work. Every single one of the 12 items in my evidence log became a numbered exhibit. I disclosed my relationship to the subject of the investigation on page 2 in full, because concealment is the one thing that would have made the whole report worthless. I recommended immediate suspension of my father's signing authority, a freeze on the Ridgemont Property Solutions account pending investigation, and a formal referral to outside counsel regarding potential prosecution for forgery and fraud, both against Renfield Industries and, separately, against me as a private individual whose signature had been used without consent. I submitted the report to Marcus Renfield on Friday morning. I tapped my pen twice before I sent it, the same ritual I use before every finding that's going to change someone's life. Then I called the county recorder's office myself, using the standing authority my firm had to flag matters under active fraud review, and requested a compliance hold be placed on the cabin deed pending the outcome of the Renfield Industries investigation, since the notary involved was implicated in both matters. The hold went through at 4:52 p.m. Friday. My father's 5-day window to force a clean signature and quietly refile the deed closed permanently at that exact moment, and he wouldn't find out until the next night in a ballroom in front of 500 people. I remember checking the confirmation email twice, the way you check a stove twice before you leave the house, not because you doubt yourself, but because some decisions deserve that kind of care. Marcus Renfield called me himself Friday evening. He said he'd read the report twice. He asked if I'd be at the anniversary gala the next night, since my father, as a regional VP, was expected to attend. I told him I hadn't decided, he said, and I remember this precisely because it's the only time in this whole story someone in a position of real power asked me a question instead of handing me an instruction. Would it help you or hurt you to walk in with me? I asked him why he was offering. He said, plainly, that the report I'd written was the most thorough piece of work he'd seen from an outside reviewer in years, that he intended to say so publicly if the occasion arose, and that he wasn't in the habit of pretending a professional relationship was smaller than it actually was just because it happened to be inconvenient for someone else's evening. He also said, with a dryness I'd come to recognize as fairly typical of him, that he'd been informed my father would likely spend the gala attempting to resolve a personal matter with me, and that he saw no reason to make that easier for him by staying out of the room. I thought about 11 years of being told I was a woman without a home. I thought about a signature that wasn't mine sitting in a folder my father slid across a dinner table like a debt he expected me to pay quietly. I thought about my grandmother, who used to say the boring parts are where a house actually lives, and about the fact that I was the only one who ever showed up for hers. I said, it would help. Which brings us back to where I started, the ballroom. The gold in the glass. My father's drink set down untouched on a passing tray. Marcus Renfield beside me in a charcoal suit, not because I needed protecting, but because the report I'd written implicated his company's money and his company's reputation, and he had every professional reason to be standing in that room that night regardless of me. My presence beside him wasn't a favor. It was two separate, entirely legitimate reasons for both of us to be exactly where we were, colliding in front of my family for the first time. My father said, "Naomi, what is he doing with you?" I said, "Dad, this is Marcus Renfield. I imagine you two have met." My father's face did the thing faces do when the ground turns out to be a trap door. He knew who Marcus Renfield was, obviously. What he didn't know, until that exact second, watching Marcus's hand settle briefly and formally on my shoulder in the specific way a client acknowledges a trusted advisor in public, was that the daughter he'd spent a decade calling unfinished, unfulfilled, a woman without a home, was the forensic auditor whose report had been sitting on the CEO's desk for 24 hours with his name in 12 separate exhibits. Marcus said, evenly, without raising his voice at all, the way I imagine he says everything that actually matters. "Walter, I've had a chance to review the compliance report on the regional office. I think we should step outside and talk before the toasts start." My mother said, "What report? Walter, what is he talking about?" My father did not answer her. He looked at me instead, and for 1 second, I watched him do the math. He was trying to figure out how much I knew, how much was already written down, whether there was still a version of tonight where this got smoothed over with the right amount of charm. I let him look. I didn't fill the silence for him, the way I'd spent 45 years filling silences for this family. I just tapped my pen twice against the small clutch in my hand, an old habit with nowhere else to go, and I let him sit in it. Aunt Ruth arrived at that exact moment, saw the four of us standing there, and said, brightly, oblivious, "Is everything all right?" I said, "Actually, Aunt Ruth, since you're here, I should probably mention that the county placed a compliance hold on the cabin deed yesterday afternoon. Something about an expired notary commission. I'm sure it's nothing, but you might want to loop in your own attorney before the transfer to Preston's company goes any further." I said it exactly the way I say everything in a client meeting when I'm delivering bad news I already expect to land hard. Level. Unhurried. Factual. Not one word of it was cruel, and every word of it was true, and that combination is the only kind of sentence that can end a conspiracy in a single breath. Preston, who I hadn't even realized was standing 4 feet away near the bar, went pale. He set his drink down with the particular carefulness of a man who has just realized the floor beneath him is thinner than he thought, and he said, too quickly, "I don't know what you're talking about," which is the kind of sentence people only say when they know exactly what you're talking about. My mother said, "What cabin transfer? Walter? Whose company?" Around us, without anyone announcing it, the small cluster of people near the bar had gone quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when it senses, before it understands, that something real is happening. A colleague of my father's, someone I recognized vaguely from a company holiday card, drifted a step closer, the way people do at parties when they can smell a story starting. I didn't lower my voice for him. I had spent 11 years lowering my voice so my family's comfort could stay intact. I wasn't going to start protecting anyone's comfort tonight, least of all my own father's. And my father, cornered by his own boss on one side and his own wife on the other, in a ballroom full of the people whose good opinion he'd spent his whole life curating, did not raise his voice. He didn't get the chance to. Marcus Renfield simply said, Let's continue this conversation in my office on Monday, Walter. Effective tonight, your signing authority is suspended pending the outcome of the review. Then he turned to me, nodded once, and said, "Thank you for your work on this, Miss Calloway," in front of every single person my family had ever wanted me to impress. My father found his voice a moment later, and what came out of it wasn't an apology. It was an old reflex, the same one he'd used my whole life to reroute a conversation back onto ground he controlled. He looked at me and said, quiet enough that only our small circle could hear it, "You did this. Your own father. You could have just signed the paper, Naomi, and none of this would have happened." I want you to notice what he did there, because it's the same move my mother made with every toast, the same move Preston made with his text message. He wasn't denying what he'd done. He was trying to make my discovery of it the crime instead of the forgery itself. I let the silence sit for a second before I answered him, the way I let silence sit before I deliver a finding a client doesn't want to hear. "I didn't do this, Dad," I said. "You did this 11 months ago in an office on a company scanner using a notary stamp that expired over a year ago. I just finished the sentence you started." I want to be honest about what that moment felt like, because I think honesty matters more than triumph here. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like a door closing on a room I'd been standing in, uninvited, for 11 years, and realizing I could simply walk away from it now, because the room no longer had any power to keep me inside it. The aftermath unfolded, as these things do, in a compressed cascade over the following weeks. My father was placed on unpaid administrative leave the following Monday, pending the outcome of both the internal investigation and, 3 weeks later, a formal referral to the district attorney's office regarding the forged deed and the falsified reimbursement records. He was not, ultimately, criminally charged. The DA's office, after review, determined the case would proceed as civil recovery rather than prosecution, largely because Renfield Industries and I both agreed we wanted restitution more than we wanted a courtroom. He resigned from Renfield Industries 2 months later rather than face formal termination, which meant no severance, no pension vesting bonus, and a professional reference that will forever contain the phrase involuntary separation pending internal review if anyone ever calls. 10 days after the gala, I got a call from Marcus Renfield's general counsel, walking me through the formal terms of the civil settlement so I could review them as the wronged party before anything was finalized. I remember sitting at my desk, Americano gone cold beside me, listening to a lawyer read out the exact dollar figures my father owed me for the fraudulent conveyance, and thinking about how strange it was that the same skill set my family had spent a decade dismissing as still figuring things out was the only reason any of this got caught, documented, and unwound before it became permanent. The cabin deed was voided by the county recorder's office 6 weeks after the gala, on the grounds of fraudulent execution and an invalid notarization. My 1/3 interest in the property was fully restored. Preston's shell company, which had already begun quietly marketing the lake frontage to developers, was forced to unwind the transaction and repay the deposit he'd collected from a buyer. A detail I only know because Aunt Ruth, furious with her son for the first time in his adult life, told me herself over the phone, crying, asking how she could have missed what was happening under her own roof. I told her, gently, that she hadn't missed it. She'd simply never been given a reason to look, because the entire scheme depended on nobody looking, and the one person expected to notice, me, had been trained for 11 years to assume good faith from people who'd never once extended the same courtesy back. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she asked if I'd still come up to the cabin this summer, the way I used to with my grandmother. I told her I would, but only if the trust paperwork reflected exactly what my grandmother originally intended: 3 equal thirds, no informal arrangements, nothing handled quietly between family members again. She agreed immediately. Ridgemont Property Solutions was dissolved by court order as part of the civil settlement. My father was ordered to repay the $340,000 he'd received from the improper sale, plus the $86,400 in fraudulent consulting reimbursements, to a restitution account jointly administered by Renfield Industries and my attorney. As of the last statement I received, he has repaid just under 1/3 of it in installments from savings that used to be earmarked for his retirement. The company, for its part, moved on the way companies do. A new regional vice president of finance was appointed within 6 weeks, a woman named Priya Ose, who I'd actually worked alongside briefly, years earlier, on an unrelated engagement, and who called me personally to thank me for the thoroughness of the report, since it had made her own transition into the role considerably cleaner than it might otherwise have been. Marcus Renfield, for his part, retained my firm for an expanded, company-wide compliance review the following quarter, citing, in the engagement letter, confidence in the reviewing team's demonstrated independence, even under significant personal conflict. I read that line more times than I probably needed to. My mother called me 4 days after the gala. She didn't apologize, not directly. She said, "I didn't know about any of this," which I believe was true, and which didn't change how many times she'd stood at a table and used my unmarried life as a punchline while her husband quietly used my name as collateral for a crime. I told her I was glad she hadn't known. I told her I needed some time before I could sit at another family dinner and pretend the last decade hadn't happened. Callie texted me a week later. Just one line. "I'm sorry we let Mom say that stuff about you all those years. I always thought it was just how she talks." I didn't respond right away. When I did, I said the truth, plainly, the way I say everything now. It was how she talked because none of you ever told her to stop. I'm not angry at the sentence anymore. I'm just done pretending it didn't cost me anything. Callie called 2 weeks after that, actually called, which she almost never does, and we talked for over an hour, longer than we'd spoken in years. She told me she'd started noticing, now that she was looking for it, how often she'd used a version of the same sentence herself on her own daughter about other things. Grades, weight, the right way to be a woman in this family. She said she was trying to stop. I told her that trying was the only part that was actually up to her, and that I'd be watching, not out of suspicion, but because I'd spent too long letting things slide to pretend I didn't notice patterns anymore. Reconciliation, when it eventually came, 4 months later, happened entirely on my terms. My mother invited me to lunch, just the two of us, no toasts, no audience to perform for. She said, across a small table at a quiet restaurant, I picked specifically because it wasn't the kind of place where anyone makes speeches, that she was sorry, and that she hadn't understood what she'd been building with a phrase she'd repeated without ever once examining it. I asked her, honestly, what she thought she'd been building. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she thought she'd been protecting me, warning me, the way her own mother had warned her. I told her that a warning and a verdict aren't the same thing, and that for 11 years, hers had sounded exactly like a verdict. I told her I appreciated the apology, and I told her the terms going forward. No comments about my marital status, ever again, at any family gathering, for any reason. If it happened once more, I would simply leave, without explanation and without negotiation. She agreed. So far, she's kept her word. We've had 2 more lunches since then, and both times, the conversation stayed where it belonged, on the present, not on a life she thought I was supposed to be living. My father has not asked for lunch. I'm not certain I'd say yes yet if he did. Here's what I learned, and I think this is the part that matters most, more than the cabin, more than the report, more than the look on my father's face in that ballroom. For 11 years, I let a room full of people define my worth using a variable I didn't even want. A ring, a home, a story that fit neatly into a toast. And the entire time, I was quietly holding actual value in my hands. A paid-off mortgage, a career built from nothing but effort, a mind trained to find the truth in numbers other people wanted to stay hidden. I let them keep grading me on the wrong exam for over a decade because I mistook composure for surrender. They aren't the same thing. Composure is just patience with a deadline nobody else can see. I also learned something about the specific danger of being underestimated by the people closest to you. Strangers underestimating you is an inconvenience. Family underestimating you, for long enough, starts to feel like a fact about the world, the way weather feels like a fact, something you plan around instead of something you're allowed to question. It took a forged signature and a 5-day compliance window for me to finally test whether the story my family told about me was true. It wasn't. It had never been true. It was just repeated often enough, at enough dinners, by enough people nodding along, that I'd started planning my life around it the way you plan around rain. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. You do not owe anyone a performance of the life you're supposed to want. You are allowed to build a version of home that doesn't come with a ring attached, and you are allowed to let the people who mock that choice keep talking, right up until the moment your evidence log is finished. Quiet does not mean unarmed. It just means the timing is yours, not theirs. And if there's someone in your life still repeating a sentence they think defines you, I gently suggest starting your own version of that evidence log. Not to punish anyone, just so that when the moment eventually comes, and it usually does, you're not standing there improvising. You're simply reading from notes you already had. I still order the same Americano, no room, extra shot, every morning before a job that matters. I still tap my pen twice before I sign anything. Some habits aren't about superstition at all. They're about making sure that whatever you're about to put your name to, you actually believe it. I believe this one completely. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear about it. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had a phrase used against you like a family motto and how long it took you to stop believing it. Share this with someone who needs to hear that composure isn't the same as staying small. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one coming. I'll see you in the next one.